A 4-year-old boy, Eric Christgen, is wearing a blue and red striped shirt. He is with a lady who works for his father, Karen Carter. Karen had taken Eric on a special trip to the mall so that his father could focus on his work. Karen had one last stop to make at a bookstore. Eric had been really excited the whole trip and had spotted a play park which he desperately wanted to go in. He asked whether he could go play there whilst Karen went into the store. She agreed, as she'd only be a moment. Minutes later, Karen returned to the play park, but Eric was gone. They searched everywhere, the mall, the car park, but he was nowhere to be found. Police were called, and it was initially believed that perhaps Eric had just gone wandering off. However, later on, several witnesses placed Eric 30 minutes after he disappeared with an older man walking down the railway tracks. This man was described as being in his mid-40s, around 200 pounds, and he held his right arm at an odd angle. He was also seen gripping Eric tightly, although all the witnesses said the boy did not seem distressed. What had started as a simple case of a boy wandering off had now turned into an abduction. Panic ensued, and the Christgen family were well known in the area, so it was initially believed that perhaps this man was looking for a ransom. Eric's father, Edwin, waited by the phone all night, but nothing came. He then released a statement saying that he would offer the perpetrator $10,000 for Eric's safe return. Nothing happened. A search party consisting of police and lots of volunteers from the local community began looking along the railway tracks and the Missouri River. They searched all day through thick undergrowth looking for this little boy. It began to get dark and the search was going to be called off when suddenly a flash of red and blue appeared. Deep inside the foliage, they'd found little Eric. A phone call was made to a nearby steakhouse where many of the volunteers were resting. Hope had dwindled that they would find Eric today. After this phone call, cheers erupted in this steakhouse as Eric had been found alive. However, after some more back and forth and follow-up calls, it was actually declared that Eric was deceased. Eric had been found along the river, not that far from the railway tracks. An autopsy revealed that he had been suffocated and, as his unbuttoned jeans suggested, SA'd. To the absolute horror and disgust of the local community, a newspaper printed a picture of Eric's deceased body on their front page. They defended their actions by saying that it was a warning to all parents not to leave their children alone, even for a moment. The police initially looked at a local psychiatric hospital as their security was known for being not that great and patients would often wander. However, this led nowhere. The FBI were involved and they stated that the perpetrator was most likely a white male, didn't have a job or had a menial job, and probably lived with his parents. The police questioned hundreds of men, including every pervert known in town, but to no avail. Fear and panic began to grip the community as the police made no progress in finding this predator that lurked among them. Police began to look at a local man, Harry Fox. He had a low IQ, he had a basic job. He held his arm out at an odd angle when he walked. He was known to be friendly towards children as well. They confronted him at his workplace and asked him to come down to the station. They told his boss that he was a suspect in the Eric Christgen case. When Harry was being interviewed, he was incredibly nervous and scared. After drinking some water, he began shaking really quite violently. He then started vomiting and convulsing on the floor. He later died of a heart attack. Harry Fox's boss had insisted to police that Harry could never have done this. He was at the office between 1 p.m. and 4 p.m. that day. He had a strong alibi. His boss also said that Harry was a lovable, gentle man. He was a lot heavier than any of the witness statements and in poor health. In hindsight, it was very unlikely that Harry could have walked that far. Harry was dismissed as a suspect, and his boss said that his death was inhumane. It was due to arrogance and a lack of compassion. Police then begin to look at another local man who had a history of inappropriate behaviour with minors. When walking along with a 3-year-old nephew, he asked him to commit a sex act on him. He had a low IQ, was unemployed, and was known as a bit of a nuisance in the local community. He also lived with his parents, and several witnesses placed him at the mall that day. 25-year-old Melvin Reynolds was brought in for questioning. He was adamant that although he was at the mall, he passed through towards the unemployment office and never saw Eric. Melvin was questioned over 9 times within a few months. He was even hypnotised. Whilst hypnotised, he maintained his innocence. However, every time Melvin was interviewed, his story changed slightly and he began to become quite uncooperative. So the police decided to take him to a local hospital and administer a truth serum or a sedative. Once this sedative was administered, Melvin began to get very drowsy and the police began to question him again. Initially, he maintained his story, but then he let slip that he walked through the mall and then killed the boy. He then backtracked quickly and said, "Oh no, I went to the unemployment office." After this slip, Melvin decided to confess. He wrote everything down because he couldn't articulate it. He said at one point the boy fainted because he was so scared and smashed his head. Reynolds stated that he was relieved to finally have it off his chest. He was charged and his lawyer said that Reynolds was mentally ill and unfit to stand trial. He should go to a psychiatric hospital. After a 30-minute psychological evaluation, Reynolds was deemed completely fit and well. The trial began and Melvin Reynolds pled not guilty. He was very adamant of his innocence. The jury returned a guilty verdict and Melvin was sentenced to life in prison. The police were widely congratulated for their work on this case. They said they checked, they double-checked, they made sure they had the right man, and they didn't leave any stone unturned. The fear and panic in the St. Joseph community died down when everyone believed that that predator had been incarcerated. 4 years later, in 1982, 11-year-old Michelle Steele makes her first trip alone into town for a dentist appointment. She takes the bus by herself. Hours later, she's still not home, so her mother rings the dentist, who confirms that Michelle made her appointment. She was there for around an hour and then left. That was 4 hours ago. Michelle's parents call the police, and the police and local volunteers begin searching. A chief inspector scolds Michelle's mother, saying, "What kind of mother are you to let your little girl go into town? Don't you know the place is full of perverts?" Michelle's father later defended their decision by saying they thought it was safe, and evidently it wasn't. Several witnesses place Michelle walking down the train tracks with an older man, akin to Eric Christgen. A search party begins along these tracks and the river. During the search, they found a blue tennis shoe, which Michelle's mother confirmed was hers. Hope dwindled that they'd find Michelle alive. Her uncle discovered some muddy footprints which led deep into some thick foliage. Following them, he found Michelle's lifeless body hidden under some branches and sticks. It was evident that Michelle had been restrained, she had been SA'd, and there were bite marks all over her body. Fear gripped the community again when they believed that there was a copycat on the loose. Initially, they suspected Michelle's uncle. He found this body in a really remote location. Also, Michelle was a very sensible girl, and no one believed that she would have walked off with someone that she didn't know. After intense questioning, Michelle's uncle was eliminated from the investigation. Akin to Eric, Michelle had died through suffocation. Her face had been held down into the mud. She was also found just 1 mile away from where Eric was found. Earlier that day during the search, some fishermen were sitting on the riverbank. A man walked past them and commented something. They said this man made them feel uneasy. There was something not quite right about him. Another volunteer said she came across a man under a bridge. She asked this man whether he'd seen a little girl anywhere, to which he responded, "Oh no, sorry, I've been fishing all day." This struck the volunteer as very odd, as the man had no fishing equipment on him at all. During the search, police also came across this man and asked him a few questions about where he'd been and whether he'd seen Michelle steal. He said no, he went to the drugstore at 7 p.m. The police began to get suspicious as the drugstore shut at 6:30. This was also important because it was known that Michelle went to that drugstore after the dentist to buy some candy. The man sort of mumbled and made excuses to say that he must have lost track of time. The police asked him for some ID and he was identified as Richard Harris. They ran a quick search but nothing came up, so they continued with their search. Hours later, Michelle's body would be found just 10 yards from where they questioned that man. After discovering Michelle's body, the police get a call from a local hospital saying they have a man that's entered that's clearly very distressed. He's sobbing, he's banging his head against the wall, he's screaming to make the voices stop. The security man grabs this man's bag and pulls out his identification, which states that he is Richard Clark. When the police arrive though, they immediately recognise this man as Richard Harris. So we have a distressed man breaking down in a hospital hours after Michelle's body has been discovered, and he is using multiple aliases. Police decide to run a check on this new identity of Richard Clark, and it comes up with several failed child abductions. Earlier that year, Richard Clark had confronted an 11-year-old boy in a grocery store. He pretended to be a security guard and accused him of shoplifting. He began to march him through the back of the store where employees are only allowed to go. On exiting the back of the store, he made headway with the boy to a remote location. The boy immediately began to think that this was not right. He yanked himself free and ran back to his mother. The police were called, but charges were eventually dropped, and Richard Clark ended up just spending a few days in a psychiatric hospital. Months later, he tried the exact same thing with a 10-year-old boy. He pretended to be a police officer this time and accused the boy of stealing. He grabbed him, but the boy yanked free and ran back to his grandmother, who was in the store. Police were called, but by the time they arrived, Richard Clark had fled. So Richard Clark had previously that year tried to kidnap 2 boys. His forensics are also all over Michelle Steele's crime scene. The muddy footprints match his. The bite marks match his dental impression, and the rope they discover in his bag match the restraints that were used on Michelle's wrists. He is brought in for questioning, but immediately goes mute and completely refuses to cooperate. He is charged with first-degree murder. In order to encourage Richard Clarke to talk, they decide to administer this truth serum again, akin to Melvin Reynolds. Once the sedative starts to take effect, Clarke goes drowsy. They begin to question him, but Clarke just falls asleep. When he is woken, he states that the voices told him to sacrifice a maiden. This isn't enough and doesn't link him to the murder of Michelle Steele. So the whole exercise was a fail. It didn't get any information out of Clarke like it did out of Melvin Reynolds. When he's held in custody, Clarke acts in the most bizarre ways. He bangs his head against the wall, he has odd facial movements, and he remains mute the entire time. He's evaluated by doctors, but they say that he is a professional faker. There's nothing wrong with him. He's just pretending to be criminally insane. But why? One day, as a guard is walking past Clarke's cell, he slips a note under the door saying that he needs to speak to the FBI. Sat opposite these FBI agents, Clarke remains mute for quite some time, until he starts writing something down. This note contains explicit instructions as to where a deceased body is. His victim is 34-year-old James Churchill, and Clarke had met him at a hospital. James Churchill was released from the psychiatric hospital, and a month later, when a nurse goes to check on him, he's missing and hasn't been seen since. In 1981, Richard Clarke and James Churchill are friends. They're hanging out by the riverbank. Unbeknown to James Churchill, Richard has been fighting the urge to kill someone all day. Eventually, he gives in and pulls out a dagger from his pocket and begins stabbing James repeatedly. So much so that the knife becomes embedded into one of James's bones. Clarke leaves, and days later he returns to look at James Churchill's body, only to discover that it's gone. He walks around and realizes that he didn't actually kill James Churchill. He was still alive when Richard Clarke left, and James had managed to drag his body a few yards away towards a path. James Churchill's lifeless body is now in view of anyone that walks past, so Richard Clarke scrambles to cover it with rocks and debris, and that is where it remains hidden. Police go out and follow the instructions written down by Richard Clarke, and they discover the skeletal remains of James Churchill. The FBI agents ask Clarke whether there are any more victims, to which he responds that there are 16. 3 of them are children, all of them are men or boys. Whilst this agent talks to Clarke, he gets this nagging feeling that he's met him before. Suddenly it dawns on him. Clarke walks with a strange limp. He holds his right arm out at a funny angle, and suddenly a sinking feeling takes over this agent. He looks up at Clarke and just says the name Eric Christgen, to which Clarke just looks at him and smiles. The FBI suddenly realise that they have convicted the wrong man. Melvin Reynolds never killed or essayed Eric Christgen, and he has been wrongly incarcerated for 4 years by this point. At the time of charging and convicting Melvin Reynolds, the FBI agent had some serious reservations. Things just didn't add up. All the witnesses who saw this man walking along the railroad tracks with Eric say that he was middle-aged and 200 pounds. At the time, Melvin Reynolds was slim and 25 years old. In Melvin's statement, he said that he sat and watched Eric in that play park for 30 minutes. Now that's just not possible, because Karen was only in that bookstore for 2 minutes max, so the timeline didn't add up. What about Melvin's previous misconduct, him asking his 3-year-old relative to commit a sex act? Well, that was nothing too. In fact, what actually happened was Melvin was walking along the road with his 3-year-old nephew when a car drove by and shouted out something abusive. Melvin retorted, "Suck my cock." Later, this was all confirmed by the 3-year-old. So Melvin didn't have any history of abusing or being inappropriate towards minors. When taken to the crime scene, Melvin also couldn't point to the exact location that Eric's body was discovered. He had to be prompted. His confession was also full of details that were fed to him, either deliberately or just insinuated. Furthermore, he had a strong alibi. His neighbour, who detested him, so had absolutely no reason to lie, said that she was talking to Melvin on his porch at the time of Eric's abduction. She said that multiple times to police, but the police were just so adamant that Melvin did it, they ignored this alibi. Melvin Reynolds, who has a very low IQ, was very susceptible to being coerced into a confession. In fact, many times he stated, "I'll admit to doing it if you want me to." He believed that at trial he'd be found not guilty and it would all come out. He was shocked when he was given a life sentence. 4 years in prison for murdering and abusing a child had not been easy. Melvin Reynolds had been repeatedly beaten, raped. He'd had an horrendous time. He felt that at the time he was targeted by police because he was gay. You need to remember this is the late 70s and there's still a lot of homophobia in the community and also within the police. So the FBI are sat there in front of this man who has admitted to murdering 16 people. There's been a huge miscarriage of justice, which has resulted in an innocent man spending 4 horrendous years behind bars. The real perpetrator has given multiple aliases. So who is he? His real name is Charles Ray Hatcher, and he was born in 1929. He was the youngest of 3 brothers. His father was an alcoholic and used to beat his family. He was heavily bullied at school, and he actually in turn became a bully himself. When Charles was younger, him and his brothers were flying a kite. As his eldest brother Arthur began to pass the kite to him, it caught on one of the power lines overhead. Now they'd made this kite from copper wire rather than string, and his eldest brother Arthur was electrocuted and instantly died right in front of Charles. This is known as the turning point. Before that, Charles was quite an intelligent, gentle boy. After this incident, Hatcher became a completely different boy. Throughout his teenage years, he commits many crimes, including burglary, theft, stealing cars. It's not until he reaches his late 20s that his crimes become far more disturbed. Aged 29, he threatens a 16-year-old newspaper boy with a knife. The boy escapes and Charles gets 5 years in prison. Whilst in prison, he gets the nickname Crazy Charlie. He is known for having random, unprovoked, violent outbursts. A fellow inmate, 26-year-old Jerry Farrington, was in jail for a couple of years because he stole some farm equipment to pay for medical bills for his wife, who had just suffered a miscarriage. He's not long into his sentence when he is found raped and stabbed to death on the prison floor of the kitchen. He had been repeatedly stabbed in the back. It was discovered that Hatcher was the only inmate missing from the kitchen crew at the time of the murder. There wasn't enough evidence to charge him, but he was sent to solitary. It's whilst in solitary that Hatcher begins to act as though he is mentally ill. He starts banging his head, mumbling, doing these odd facial expressions. He's sent to see a psychiatrist, but they say he is a fake. During the 60s, Hatcher is in and out of prison. He uses various aliases, and it's very difficult to track him down or see his criminal history. He manages to escape from a Kansas prison. 8 days after he escapes, in 1969, he lures a 5-year-old boy away with the promise of ice cream. He began to violently beat and attempt to sodomize this little boy. Luckily, a dog walker was walking past, saw what was happening, and immediately went to rescue this boy. When he was charged and convicted, Charles gave the name of Albert Price. The judge said that this was the worst case of child molestation he had ever seen. He was charged with kidnapping and attempted sodomy. Hatcher, knowing what would happen to him as a child molester in prison, begins to act insane again. He would fake suicide attempts, say he's having visions of bloody children. And this worked this time. Remember, he's giving a different alias, so they can't track his previous convictions or reports. He spends many years in a hospital being evaluated. They can't decide whether he is insane, he's not, or what's wrong with him. Eventually, they decide that he's faking it, and this is after years of being in a psychiatric hospital. So he is sent to prison. Charles is terrified of prison and tries to escape. A psychiatrist says he was manipulative, dangerous, and there's just no chance for rehabilitation. Despite all this, despite the severity of his crime, despite his psychiatric report, he is given parole. He is given a glowing review by officers saying that he's shown remorse. He's a model prisoner. He accepts full responsibility for his behaviour. So less than 8 years after attacking this 5-year-old boy, he is released. 1 week after being released, he violates his parole and flees. 1978, Charles Ray Hatcher has fled his parole and starts to use the alias Richard Clark. In the September of that year, he SAs a 16-year-old boy. The police run a check on this Richard Clark and come up with nothing. They never think to fingerprint him, and so he is sent to go to a psychiatric hospital for a few days. 6 months later, in May 1979, he is arrested for the attempted murder of a 7-year-old boy. He assaults and tries to stab little boy Thomas Moore. Charges are eventually dropped, and he again is sent to spend a few days in a psychiatric hospital. In 1980, he tries to sodomize a 17-year-old boy. He spends just 21 days in hospital for this and then is released. Days after being released, he tries to stab a man in a fight. Each crime is in a different city, a different state, using a different alias, so they never link the dots. They never see his previous history. No one ever thinks to fingerprint him and run a check. They take the identity that he gives, and he gives many, over 15 or 16 of these different aliases. So he is getting away with crime after crime after crime. Along with these crimes, he manages to get away with murder. One day he's in a mall in St. Joseph's and he sees a 4-year-old boy in a play park. The next day, Eric Christgen is all over the news, and Melvin Reynolds has been named as the perpetrator. Now his identity is exposed. The FBI have realised that this is Charles Ray Hatcher and linked him to many other crimes. He admits to the murder of Michelle Steele, Eric Christgen, James Churchill and Jerry Tharrington. However, he never gives up the names of the 12 other victims. When looking through old psych reports, they come across one where Charles is admitting to having the same vision over and over again. And this vision is of a little boy riding a bike. He's then in the car happily with Charles. They're then by the creek, and suddenly Charles's hands are around this little boy's neck. They link this to the case of 12-year-old William Freeman. William Freeman had gone to play tennis with his friends. He was travelling back home via his bike when witnesses say a man driving a green car pulled up next to him and began to talk to little William. It is assumed that William got into this car because his bike was left at that exact spot. The next day, children discover the lifeless body of William face down in a creek. So through these psychiatric reports, they managed to solve the case of William Freeman and link him to the perpetrator, Charles Ray Hatcher. So Charles Ray Hatcher pleads guilty to Eric Christgen's murder. He gets life without parole. The police officers that ran the Eric case don't believe that Charles is the perpetrator. They are still adamant that they think Melvin did it. They are dumbfounded that the court have accepted Charles's confession. They believe that the FBI fed Hatcher information in order to admit to Eric's murder. In the end, Chief Inspector Hayes is ordered to not talk about the case of Eric Christgen in public ever again. Melvin Reynolds' conviction is overturned and he is a free man. He never sought compensation. He said he just wanted to get on with his life. He actually said he was partly at fault for confessing to the murder anyway. He said the only thing that really tore at him was the fact that the real perpetrator was still out there. Hatcher also pled guilty at trial to the murder of Michelle Steele, and this was in order to get his sentence elevated to the death penalty. He even stated in court that that's what you should give me. I've escaped from prison once and I'll do it again. The jury, however, gave him a life sentence, and the community were outraged at this, but those that knew him were happy with the result. In December 1984, as a guard passed Hatcher's cell, he looked in and discovered that Charles Ray Hatcher had hung himself. Charles didn't like that he'd been found out, and he certainly didn't want to spend the rest of his days in prison. So he decided to take his own life. My name's Emma. This has been the case of Charles Ray Hatcher. If you like my content, please remember to like, subscribe and comment, and I will see you in the next one.